Welcome back, everyone, to ANHD's training around the Equitable Development Data Explorer, or the EDDE, and the Displacement Risk Index. My name is Alex Fennell, and I'm the Senior Political Organizer at ANHD, and along with my colleague.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abdul, and I'm the graduate intern at ANHD.
We are walking through this new tool. This is going to be the fourth module of this training, and we are starting to dive into some of the data. So if you haven't already figured out how to kind of navigate the tool and sort of the basics, all of that is covered in the previous modules. In the first one, we cover sort of the history, how we got here, why this tool matters. In the second module, we cover the basic interface and what the tool looks like, what's in the tool. And then in the third module, we covered how to find a specific district. So we're going to jump into this next module, module number 4, with the assumption that you already know how to or have found your district to start thinking about and understanding the information available in the tool. So basically, data for my district. This is walking through what data does the EDDE show. Our overview for this section is we are introducing guiding questions. For the rest of the training, we'll be using 3 guiding questions to take us through how we can use the tool. We'll also be looking at what data is available for the district that you're looking at. That falls under a number of categories of demographics, economic security, housing security, affordability and quality, housing affordability and quality, and housing production. There's a lot of information under each one of these categories, and Abdul is going to take you through maybe not every single data point, but definitely enough that you'll have an understanding of what's there. So if we shift to our guiding questions, we've said already that we are looking at the neighborhood of Jackson Heights and Corona throughout this training. So we've already found that district on our map. And we're looking at a set of 3 questions, which are questions that you might want to ask about your neighborhood. Or if you are an advocate or an organizer, you might want to ask for either the neighborhood you live in or the area where you're working. And to start thinking about what information is available about your community and how can that uplift sort of advocacy organizing efforts. So the 3 guiding questions we've selected are, which of my neighbors are most at risk of being pushed out of our neighborhood? We all know that displacement is happening in many neighborhoods throughout New York City. So who's at most risk? What does the EDDE and the Displacement Risk Index tell us about that? Then what's the financial situation for the majority of my neighbors? Oftentimes we can find the average, sort of the average income of a community, but we're looking for a fuller picture. What are people's actual financial situation, not just the average income of the neighborhood? And then lastly, what are some assets and resources in the neighborhood that most of my neighbors have access to? So I think that question is pretty straightforward. And we're going to be using the EDDE and the Displacement Risk Index to answer these questions and see how well it can answer them. So Abdul is going to be highlighting as he goes through the information, if something connects to these questions, he'll be sort of linking that. And then in a later module, we'll thoroughly go through, we'll have a whole module just of looking at how did the EDDE answer these questions and was it successful, was it helpful? All of that said, I am going to pass it over to Abdul to walk us through the tool.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. So we're going to get back to the EDDE here. And as you can see on my screen, we're back on the homepage of the EDDE. We decided in our previous module to focus on the community district of Jackson Heights in North Corona and Northern Queens. So if you don't know where that is or how to select that, our previous module covers that. I'm going to jump right in and select it from the EDDE from the community data view. So right here, we've got Jackson Heights in North Corona. And as you'll see on the left, there's information about the community district and then the 5 data categories that we aim to cover in this module. We'll just jump right in, starting with demographic conditions. So when I click on that here, a data table page will pop up. That gives me a few different data points related to the population and demographic area, or the demographic population statistics that is related to this area. Particularly, this category holds information about race, age, foreign-born population, and limited English-speaking population. All this information can be very helpful when we think about just who represents or makes up our communities, and in particular when we understand aspects of how race is implicated in housing disparities and economic disparities, as well as how immigration status, foreign language status, and even age can impact the ways that we experience a lot of social factors. Having this information on hand can really help us understand then who may be most vulnerable in a particular neighborhood. What's really important for us to gather as we're looking here is to think about just who makes up the majority of a population, who makes up less of the space, and how has that population changed over time. And a really helpful thing for some of the data points within the community data view tables is that they'll have their data in these columns separated by the years that the data was collected, or that information was collected. So you can see here that we have the census from 2000, the census from 2010, and the census from 2020. And while each of these are not going to be perfect in reflecting the entire population that's in an area, they aim to collect as much information about who is where and the demographics of those people when they're collected every 10 years. As you remember, one of our guiding questions is thinking about what is the financial situation for the majority of our neighbors. And one thing that might be really helpful is you may want to understand which particular racial or ethnic groups make up the majority of your community district. And even looking at this first table here, we can get a pretty clear idea looking through, say we're looking at the column for 2020 census, which is the most recent set of numbers. We can see that in Jackson Heights and North Corona, the Hispanic population makes up about 65%. So they are a clear majority in that area. And then other population that takes up, or there's a large population of them, is the Asian non-Hispanic population at about 19%. So say that I was interested then in understanding more about the Hispanic population, since they are the majority of that community district, I can go back up to the top here and specifically select Hispanic from this drop-down menu to then look at all of the data for age, foreign-born population, and limited English-speaking population from the perspective of the Hispanic population in this community district. So when I do that, I can learn that there's about 69% of folks who are between the ages of 16 to 64 years within Jackson Heights and North Corona. I may also learn something about how the percentage of folks who were born outside of the United States, which in this situation is about 63% of people. Having information like that can be really helpful because then we understand kind of intersectional identities that are occurring within a population and how that might be impacting people's lives. If we know that there might be a particularly young or working class set of Hispanic folks who live in this community district versus say maybe like an elderly white population that might live in a district, and knowing that they have differences in what they experience. As you choose to go through the demographic conditions page when you're looking for your own community district, it's really helpful to move around and play around with the different categories of racial population, just understand differences. So then we might look here at the Asian non-Hispanic population really quickly, and knowing that they're the next largest group, but kind of pretty far away in terms of how many people make up that community, we can see that they have a similar percentage of folks who are 16 to 64 years old in that area. But then when we look at the foreign-born population, it's slightly higher than it is for the Hispanic population. So that is information that's helpful to know too, because then we have a better idea of maybe immigration trends that are happening within our community districts as well. So that's a quick overview of the demographic conditions page. And there's a lot more information that you can gather and also a lot of stories that you can tell from that. But we just wanted to give a quick view of that. The next thing that we're going to look at is the household economic security data that's related to Jackson Heights and North Corona. And this particular information is helpful because it gives us a sense of what the economic situation is for folks within this community district. That can include the opportunities that are available to them because of particular jobs that they can access and the income levels that they're at. So I already started scrolling a little bit, but you can see that some of the data tables here that are related to that are educational attainment. A really important one is median household income, which represents the kind of middle point between the highest and lowest incomes that are earned within that community district. One that's related to housing that's very important is looking at households by their area median income or their comparison to. So this is how we kind of determine at multiple different stages of the housing process who is considered very low or extremely low income and who is considered moderately or high income within a community. We also have information here, as I mentioned, about the labor force, who's working, and the different jobs that they take up, either separated by occupation here or separated by industry. And what's really helpful is that the community data view also gives us some information on the wages earned by industry or the median wages earned. So you can get a quick idea of how much money folks are typically making within those different fields. Once again, we have the option of looking at this information by race. And so if we're thinking again that we know the majority of this population is Hispanic, and we're trying to think from our guiding questions, what is the financial situation for the majority of our neighbors in this area? We might think about, all right, what is the experience that the Hispanic population has when it comes to educational attainment, which we know has some level of impact on the jobs that they can pursue in the future and the amount of money that they can earn. And when we look at this information, we'll see that about, if we kind of added these two numbers together, the 34.2% here for less than a high school degree and 39.2% for a high school degree or equivalent, then we have about, and let's see if I can do math well, we have about 75% of folks who have a high school degree or less who identify Hispanic within Jackson Heights and North Corona. That still means that they do have job options available to them, but as we understand, the kind of level of job options that give them high wages are maybe less possible because there are fewer folks who have college degrees or some college education. We can also then compare this then to thinking about another population. So if we compare that to the white non-Hispanic population that's within Jackson Heights and North Corona, we'll see that there's about over half of white non-Hispanic identifying folks within North Corona have a bachelor's degree or higher. So we see there that there's an educational disparity that's related to race that's occurring within this district, and that informs other aspects of opportunity. Let's hop back real quick to the Hispanic population to then understand some of their experiences within their socioeconomic status. So in looking at the median household income, we see that the Hispanic population earns about $55,000 on an annual basis as of the most recent collection of data. When we want to compare that back to the total population, so we can go back to the drop-down menu here, the total population earns about $59,000. And so the Hispanic population, based on those numbers, typically earns less than what is seen within the total population. So when you get that kind of separation, you start to see that numbers on a broad kind of total population scale are not going to be reflective of the specific experiences. And so it's a good reminder to yourself to always choose that drop-down menu as much as possible to break down the story that maybe broader numbers are trying to tell you. All right, I'm going to hop back to the Hispanic population one more time so we can just sift through some more data here. So as I mentioned before, there's households by area median income. And what this information, as I said, tells us is like who is at different income levels within this area. And that income level is usually determined by the percentage of income that someone has compared to that median income that we saw before. And when we look here, we can see that about 60% or more of the Hispanic population within Jackson Heights and North Corona earns, let me make sure I'm phrasing this right, earns 80% or less than the area median income, which means that's over half of that population. And that places about over half of that population within a lower income to extremely low income category. That informs a lot of our thinking then about maybe housing that's affordable to them, or even the lived experience they have, knowing that they only earn so much money compared to the median amount of money that's earned in the area. And then if we look towards things like the occupation, we can start to get an idea of where folks within a particular, either total population or particular racial group are working within this community district. And one thing that we can see here is that we have a kind of, not a majority, because that would be over 50%, but a large number of people, about 37%, who work in service jobs who identify as Hispanic and who are within the working population of Jackson Heights and North Corona. So this is information, once again, that informs the ways that we think moving forward. And what's great about even how these categories are organized is that you start to build up your story and understanding your community as you go down. So we went from demographics to knowing who's here, to now we know about what do they earn, and how does that income start to play into their lives. And now we want to move over to the next category, which is housing affordability, quality, and security, which encompasses a few different things, but largely you can think of this as like, what is the housing situation within this community, related to how people live and experience it. The next category that we'll see is related to housing production, and that's more of like what's physically being built. But this category here gets us to what is the day-to-day experience of housing. And so the data tables here cover things like housing tenure, which is basically who is renting and who is owning the housing unit that they stay in. We get to the home median home value, so how much is the home that is owned worth? And then we get into two really important categories related to rent. Median gross rent tells us about, once again, the middle point between the lowest and highest rents that are being paid within this community district. And then gross rent as a percentage of household income tells us the number and percentage of folks who are paying 30% or more of their income towards rent, or even 50% or more of their income towards rent, which signifies that they are rent burdened or severely rent burdened. This is really important information because it informs not only what people are giving towards their rent, but tells us how much money they aren't able to spend on other essential needs that are within their lives. May it be medical needs, educational needs, related to other family members, and things of that sort. And then we have a data table on the rental units that are affordable to households by AMI level, or for area median income. So if you remember when we were back in the previous data category, we were able to kind of see folks by their different levels compared to the AMI. This table is really helpful in then thinking about how many units are available for all of those different groups of people. And you can do, while this information might not be, while the information from the household economic security may not be entirely accurate, because as I said, those surveys that are collected don't always capture everyone, it does give us a broad idea of like, are the number of units matching up to the number of people who need units at that amount? And then the last few tables here are related a bit more to the experiences of being in or out of housing. Overcrowding is a major issue that occurs within different housing units around the city, and that's one of the tables here. And then experiences with evictions executed by city marshals is depicted here on this table. The number of folks who are within the shelter system within this community district is reflected here. And then the number of kind of affordable housing or income restricted housing and public housing that's available within the area. So we ran through all of that information just to understand that. Once again, if we wanted to understand this for the folks who make up the majority of our districts, we might look again at the Hispanic population. And so when we're looking here, we can see that the Hispanic population makes up about 76% of the Hispanic population identify as renters or are renting they don't identify, they are renting their housing units within this district. If we go back to the total population, we'll see that 65% of folks are renters. So the Hispanic population in Jackson Heights and North Corona rents much more than the total population. If we want to compare that then to the white non-Hispanic population, we'll find that the majority of white non-Hispanic folks within Jackson Heights and North Corona are actually owners. So they kind of have a flipped experience of home ownership or housing within the area. Jumping back to the Hispanic population here and going on to rent, we can see that the median gross rent for Hispanic folks is about $1,600. When we compare that to the total population, then we see that that rent is about similar. It's about the same amount for the total population. And then if we jump back again to compare it to, say, the white non-Hispanic population, we see that the rent is once again within a similar area, but a little bit lower compared to the other groups. And then moving through, a really important measure, as I said, is the gross rent as a percentage of household income. And this is one of the disparities that you really want to keep track of, because it also helps us know who's most at risk of being pushed out of our neighborhood, which is one of our guiding questions. If someone is rent burdened or extremely rent burdened, or severely rent burdened rather, then as we said, they don't have as much money to put towards other needs. And they might be in a situation where they're kind of in survival mode, trying to make sure that they can pay for rent each month rather than having extra means available for everything else. And so what we can see here is that within this community district, about 64% of folks are rent burdened, which means they pay 30% or more of their income towards rent. And then 36% are severely rent burdened. So we know that the majority of Hispanic identifying folks are in that situation here. When we compare that to the white non-Hispanic population within Jackson Heights and North Corona, as an example, we find that 51% of folks, which is still the majority of that population, or over half at least, is experiencing rent burden, while 31% are severely rent burdened. So still a high number of folks as well, different when comparing between race though, which shows us that there's a bit of urgency for folks who are Hispanic in their rent burden issues that may not be reflected in the same for the rest of the population. And so that's a quick overview of what we can learn from the housing affordability, quality, and security category. There's a lot more, as I said, that you can find going through here, but a lot more than we'll go through in this training. But it was really helpful to then understand the landscape of housing and how you live it. The next category is housing production. And this is a unique category because you actually cannot look at this data broken down by race, because the data, rather than being collected for specific people, is actually collected for the number of housing units. So it's focused on buildings rather than on people. When we look at this information for Jackson Heights and North Corona, we can see the kind of rates of new buildings or changes to buildings that have happened in the community. And so we can see that between 2010 and 2020 here, there's been about 1,400 new buildings that have been, or rather 1,400 new housing units that have been built through new buildings within the district. And then we can see that there have been a certain number of alterations to increase units, and a certain number of demolitions that have reduced the number of units. This number is really helpful because it helps us get an understanding of how development trends are impacting this community district. If we see that there's a lot of production that's happening, then we know that there's a lot of developers coming in and making new buildings. But then when we scroll down more, we get a better idea of, well, how many of those new buildings or preserved buildings are actually going towards people at different affordability levels. So we come back again to our measures of income by AMI level, and we can see that for the number of units with regulatory agreements, which are units that have some kind of program that allows for a level of affordability to be attached to them, there's a pretty small number, about, I want to say, if I can do my math very quickly, a little over like 120 or so units that have regulatory agreements on them that are available to low income to extremely low income folks. This does not reflect, as we saw in the other numbers, the number of people who experience those levels of income. So this tells us a little bit about how much more housing is probably necessary within Jackson Heights and North Corona to meet the needs of folks at those income levels. And then we can look at things like another piece of information is area within a historic district, which is helpful sometimes in understanding what buildings are available both for preservation and for demolition, which impacts then what development can occur within an area. Before we jump on to the next category, since we can't show this compared by race, I do want to show this category compared to another community district so you can get an understanding of maybe how the housing production is different between two districts. So I'll jump back to the map real quick, and this will also be an example of how to do that. There's a back to map button that's right above the title, so easy to navigate. And if I'm going back to the map here, it still has Jackson Heights and North Corona selected here. I'm going to choose one that's kind of adjacent to that. So let's say that I choose Flushing, Murray Hill, and Whitestone as the other example. If I click on their housing production tab, then I can see a new set of data related to that. Now, if you remember when we were looking at Jackson Heights and North Corona, there's about 1,400 housing units that were developed in new buildings. When we're looking at Flushing, Murray Hill, and Whitestone, there's about 5,300 new units that have been built. So even in places that are adjacent to each other, this is right next to Jackson Heights and North Corona, there can be a drastic change in the development practices and speed of development that's occurring in areas, which informs a lot about who's being pushed out, how's the neighborhood changing, and what's available for folks at different income levels. We can even see here that the differences in this particular housing situation is that there's a lot more units that have been built, or not a lot more, but a few more units that have been built that meet low income to extremely low income needs. But these buildings have been made mostly through new construction, while when we were looking at the Jackson Heights and North Corona example, they were in the right column, which means that they were preserved units or units that were maintained or made affordable that already existed. All right, so we're gonna make it on to our last data category. We're gonna jump back to Jackson Heights here on the map and then jump over to quality of life and access to opportunity. This data category gets to our last guiding question, which is what are some of the assets and resources in the neighborhood that most of your neighbors have access to? And what this category covers is things related to services that might be near to people, as well as outcomes related to some factors that are that people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives. The first set of data tables that you'll see here are health outcomes. They're related to things like diabetes and other kind of typical or chronic diseases or illnesses that folks may have, as well as tables here on mortality, so premature mortality or infant mortality. And then we have things related to overdose and drug-related overdose deaths and COVID-19 deaths. And then the last health outcomes table here is heat vulnerability, which is a kind of index that is used to measure the levels of heat that an area experiences, as well as the kind of resources they have to mitigate or deal with that heat. So if you have air conditioning, if you're in an area that has a lot of shade and has a good tree cover to make sure that you can stay cool there as well. And then the next set of tables that are here are related to access, access for various different things. We have access to jobs, and particularly the distance you have from a job that's within 30 minutes. We have access to transit, particularly the select bus stations and ADA accessible subway stations for folks who have disabilities. And then we have things related to commute that kind of puts those two things together. So how long does it take you to, or do you have the ability to drive or carpool to work within whatever distance that means for you? And then the next set of tables are related to education. One that was especially important as we entered the COVID-19 pandemic was access to broadband internet at home, which still impacts not only the educational opportunities of young people within our different districts, but also impacts people's ability to work from home and to take on jobs that are remote in that way. Then we jump into things like educational outcomes, such as young people's testing scores, and their graduation rates. And then the next one is another access table related to open space or park access, which is really important when we're thinking back up to the health outcomes and different kind of experiences that people have related to green space and tree canopies and shade and things like that. And then the last set of tables here are all related to public safety, either related to traffic-related safety issues, so being traffic-related accidents and injuries or fatalities, or things related to kind of like human experiences of pedestrian injury that might occur on the street, or assaults, hospitalizations as well. All of this information gets us back to being able to look at this broken down by race again. So if we are looking at a lot of this information and we're interested in maybe the access that folks have to different resources, we may look at first the total population to see how are folks able to access, how many folks are able to access their jobs nearby. We can see that a large number, about 111,000 folks, are able to reach their jobs within 30 minutes in the total population. We can also see that about 23.7% of folks are able to drive or carpool to work. Now, if we look at that for the majority of the population, which we know is the Hispanic population in our community district, we can then see that, actually, this is an important point. I forgot it, but it's important that we got to it now, is that there's some data that's within this particular category that is not available to see by race and ethnicity. This is an example, and a lot of the tables here you can see say data are not available by race or ethnicity. So this is an example here where you can only really get the total population information, or you may need to look back at the data sources that are available in methods and sources to see where did they get that information from, because maybe they've broken it down in a different way back at the original source that we're not able to view here. So I'll try to find a better example that we're able to view on this by race. And so one example here that we're able to see is the, let's say we want to look at the percentage of folks who have graduated high school by 2018. For the Hispanic population, that's about 75% of folks. And when we look at that compared to the total population, we have about 78%. So the number is not too far off, which shows that they're kind of on trend with what's happening within the total population. And then we have other things related to the commute. That was a number that we were able to see before. So we saw that that was about 24% for the total population, while for the Hispanic population within the community, that was about 23%. So once again, pretty close to that. This informs a bit of our understanding of what things people have access to regularly, and if there's a disparity between them and their neighbors by maybe racial identity or other factors. And this information kind of helps to round out our really quick data kind of bird's eye view understanding of community district. If you're looking at your own district, you obviously know everything that happens in between that this data is not able to reflect. And it's really important that you can kind of infuse this information with the qualitative or kind of story and lived experience that you have. But this is how you go about navigating the community data view of the EDDE. And what we'll do now is pass you on to an activity to kind of practice this on your own, and maybe you can try to learn more about your district. And then we'll go into learning more about the displacement risk map after this. So thank you so much.